Good morning, everyone. Welcome to um, the Department of Social Work and Social Care, Kingston University and St. George's University of London's annual conference. We're pleased to see that there's quite a lot of you that have joined us today, and we're looking forward to a very interesting, stimulating, and engaging conference. Um, this year, our theme is New Thinking and Practice in Services for Domestic Violence and Abuse. And as we're all aware, these are difficult times that we're living in now, and we feel this really speaks to our practice within social work. And as social workers, we're critical workers who are equally in the front line and in supporting families, children, and adults, and all the other service user groups, people with lived experience that we work with. This year, our theme fits in well with the Social Work World Day celebration theme of Ubuntu. I am because we are, strengthening social solidarity and global connectedness. So we're hoping that you will engage in our discussions today, and that throughout today we'll be able to learn from yourselves, and you also learn from our speakers. We have very exciting, interesting speakers. We're going to be covering some very relevant topics, and we look forward to your participation. Just enjoy the day, and let's celebrate Ubuntu, because we are all working together. And as the theme said, I am because we are. I think that really underpins what we'd like to focus on in our conference today on new thinking and practice in services for domestic violence and abuse. I'm grateful to my colleagues in the department who have been able to put this together, and to colleagues in the university across. And we will be giving more thanks when we get to the end of the conference. But I just want to acknowledge the fantastic work and hard work that has gone into putting the conference today. I also want to thank our presenters, but more importantly, Professor Malcolm Payne, who's been chairing our conferences for a number of years. And I'm going to hand over to Malcolm Payne to start us off. Thank you all for joining us.
Right, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Kingston and St George's annual conference on social care and social work matters. This is in part a research conference. It's an opportunity for people to hear about recent research and for people to shift their focus to the new issues that social work is facing. And we find a different topic every year which is central to some of the issues of practice and education that we're involved in. It's also a wonderful opportunity to bring together the people that we work with in local communities around Kingston, and on this occasion more widely, because you can participate in the conference not having to travel to Kingston to be involved. So it's a really important opportunity to have the chance to engage with some of the new thinking that's around and to think about research methods. We're going to operate on our usual pattern, but online. So this morning there will be two plenary sessions of about an hour each with three speakers giving a brief introduction to work that they're involved in. There'll be time for questions at the end of each group of three speakers. In our first session, we have two speakers, Brid Featherstone and Kate Morris, who are going to be talking about a change project, research that they're involved in. And then Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, a fairly new post to the government, and the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. And then some real connection with practice involvement locally in Amanda McIntyre from For Baby's Sake. So that's the programme for our first hour. I want to introduce then Brid Featherstone and Kate Morris, and hand over to them to talk about the Change Project and the agenda for domestic abuse. Brid, Kate.
So thank you everyone, and thank you for asking Brid and I to contribute to what is such an important and timely event. I'm going to start just with some very personal reflections actually. Over 35 years ago, I, like many women of my age, joined marches to reclaim the streets. We were involved in all sorts of activities. And I never imagined 35 years ago that my daughter would now be marching to reclaim the streets. This has been a terrible recent time, and I just want to really pause for a minute's reflection to honour all those that should have been safe and weren't. And so let's just pause for just a few seconds to reflect on and think about those that weren't safe and should have been. So I think Brid and I would both say it is in part our frustration that we have seen so little change that drives us and drives our work in this area, and a strong sense of the inequalities and injustices that run through this. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's been actually a very hopeful piece of work. We're going to talk a bit about our work with research and practice. We need to acknowledge the fantastic support we've had from colleagues in research and practice to really work for, I think now, 18 months with 30 local authorities, with domestic abuse services, with men, with women, to really start to think about the positioning of domestic abuse and violence in child protection, what's currently happening, some of the really profound problems that we face, and what might be possible going forward. And so whilst it's been a very challenging change project, I think Brid would say with me it's also been a very hopeful one. And our colleagues in the 30 local authorities and in the domestic abuse services have been fantastic in terms of joining us on this journey. When we kind of articulate why the need for change in this area, and this is part of a bigger piece of work that Brid and I have been doing, the Change Project was very focused on what we are calling intersecting inequalities. The social and economic circumstances and conditions in which women, men and families find themselves have a significant influence on shaping their experiences in relation to child protection, domestic abuse and violence. And Brid will talk a little bit more about this as we go through, but one of the key issues raised for us all was that current practices, processes, systems focus primarily on women and mothers, and that too often we heard from women, from family members, from child protection and domestic abuse practitioners, this morphed into mother blaming. This changed into holding women accountable for their safety of their children, when often their own safety was at best uncertain. And as part of that was a narrative about assessing how well they could protect their children in the context of the harm they were enduring and experiencing. And a real sense amongst practitioners that this was not ethically, morally, or indeed practically where they would want to be positioned, that they knew the frustrations and the often futility of that approach to trying to address the harm caused by domestic abuse and violence. So a real frustration about current positioning and responses, but also a real sense that actually there's a huge gap in what we do, in that there is no sustained engagement with the men, with the person who is causing the harm. And time again during the Change Project, practitioners talked about feeling de-skilled, unconfident, anxious, poorly equipped to work. And the men talked to us about the absence of engagement with them. So we're really starting to arrive at a picture of an approach that isn't, we would say, fit for purpose. And workers and across the sector talked about what did this end up with us doing? Well, quite often it was a routine practice that there must be separation, with little attention paid to the feasibility, practicality of that, with women often being put in invidious positions with inadequate resources and asked to make impossible choices. One woman talked at length about the fact she had created, so frustrated was she with what the responses were, she'd created her own safety plan, but actually no professionals or practitioners would pay attention to the safety plan that she'd devised. So we're often using fairly blunt, catch-all, one-size-fits-all strategies. We talked about the absence of work with families to understand in a very nuanced way what domestic abuse for that family, for that woman, for that man, for that children, what it meant, what responses were appropriate, how their social and economic circumstances impacted and influenced. So real frustration on the part of workers that they didn't have an opportunity to do some of the work that they thought would embed sustained change. And we talked a lot about how we are caught within this paradigm really of unsafe certainty, so that we are looking for certainty in working where domestic abuse and violence is an issue for and poses child protection concerns. We're adopting a position that simply isn't sustainable. We are looking for certainty. We are predicting and arguing certainty in an unsafe way. So a real sense that what we have now is not fit for purpose. Some very big questions about the positioning of domestic abuse and violence in the context of child protection. Some big questions about who is the focus of our activity and what's the sustainability of adopting that approach. And a very strong narrative from women, from men, from children and young people that our current approaches have multiple, often unintended, but multiple challenging, difficult, painful outcomes. I'm going to hand over to Brid at this point, but the key question we were all left with was, if we have such a robust analysis of existing difficulties, and we know all this, the women, the young people, the men that joined us in the Change Project, the practitioners, were rehearsing an analysis they have rehearsed many times. Why have we not seen change? What are the barriers? What are the blocks to change? What is making this such a difficult area for us to move forward on? And I'm going to hand over to Brid at this point to talk some more about that. Why so little change? Well, firstly, we really think that it's time to reimagine, as we would say, bound to, given our book, but really reimagine and rethink the conceptual underpinnings for the ways in which we are tackling the domestic abuse in the context of child protection. We understand the reasons why domestic abuse became recognised as a child protection issue, and the importance of paying attention to the consequences of domestic abuse for children and for young people. We also understand that at the point that it became part of child protection, there was also a concern that it was a possibility to arrive at better services for women. However, we haven't heard or seen evidence that that has played out for children, for young people, for women, and indeed for men. So we're arguing that we need to really rethink how we understand these experiences and how we understand the role of inequalities and intersecting inequalities in addressing domestic abuse and violence and its consequences for family members and for communities. We have an issue with one size fits all. We did a case file audit as part of the Change project, where we saw and tried to understand how domestic abuse and violence was being interrogated in child protection. What was very telling from this, and what's caused practitioners concern as they've completed that case file audit, is that actually we just have a set of catch-all shorthands. Domestic abuse is just routinely referred to with no interrogation of what that actually means for that family, for that woman, for those children. We have no differential responses in terms of the experiences for Black and minority ethnic women, for women in highly deprived communities compared to women in affluent communities. We've got a one-size-fits-all. We rarely see working with men to challenge change in a sustained way, harmful behaviour. That's business, that's work that is contracted out to specialist services, to often very precariously funded services. There's a high level of anxiety amongst practitioners about actually making things worse, in particular making things worse for those who are the subject of the abuse and violence. And in so doing, sometimes we prefer to take no action rather than any action. And that's connected to a real sense that we have inadequate skills and confidence in this area. So we could see from the Change project a whole set of very important barriers to change.
Okay, so there are two themes in the Change project. One is clearly about thinking differently, and from that we hope that doing differently will flow. However, we've realised that maybe that's a wee bit naive, that actually there is this huge interface between thinking and doing differently, which relates to culture and systems and to the difficulties of really trying to change things. But if we start by saying what we mean by thinking differently, as Kate has already indicated, there's been a lot of shorthand talk in children's services about domestic abuse. It's actually referred to often as DA or DV, or there's DV in that family. And actually there hasn't been enough really fine-grained, granular drilling down into what do we mean by domestic abuse. We haven't really kept up with the literature and the scholarship from across the world that looks at different types of abuse, situational couple violence, intimate terrorism, violence that's associated with a great deal of risk in the latter case, but situational couple violence which tends to be different in origin and is more about controlling situations rather than controlling people, and has, it would appear, more hope of change, and is certainly not as terrifying and worrying for gender equality as intimate terrorism is. The other thing, so we haven't spent enough time. We do have risk checklists. We do have these attempts to try and differentiate, but they're not sophisticated enough and they're not used routinely. So one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about was the literature on different types of abuse. So helping practitioners and managers to really think about what is going on in this family. And a key message that came out of it was the importance of listening to women's and men's and children's stories and hearing what it means for them, rather than going in with our categories and saying this is DA. Secondly, as Kate has already mentioned, we have used intersectionality a lot to think about the differences between men and the differences between women. Very important in the current climate to think about the fact that not all women, for example, trust the police. So when we develop children's services agendas that are about strengthening multi-agency working, getting the police and social workers to work better together, we actually are sending out signals to parts of the community that may be extremely problematic and extremely unwelcome. We also think that it's really important that we look at the differences between men, the differences between men in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their class, their identity, their race. So we've been using an intersectionality and inequalities lens to understand the differences between men and women, not only in terms of how they experience domestic abuse, but also in terms of what they need and want from services. And for example, we worry a lot about the poverty blindness of an approach that just says to women, you must separate from him, but doesn't pay attention to their housing needs, to their financial needs, and to indeed to their needs for support if we move them from one borough to another or from one place to another. Doing differently clearly flows from thinking differently. So it was really important in the Change Project to engage with both the humanity of people involved in domestic abuse. So we spent a lot of time listening to and hearing from people who were involved in domestic abuse in different ways, and not just though in voyeuristically hearing stories. What we wanted as well, as Kate has already said, to hear their ideas about system design, to hear their ideas about how things could work. So it was very salutary when one woman talked about the way in which she devised a safety plan that she felt was really clearly going to work for her and her family, that was just dismissed by the children's services because it wasn't seen as relevant to them, or they didn't see it as adequate. We have also spent a lot of time though, we have been doing the Change program during a pandemic when our workers and managers have been exhausted, have been on a corona coaster, as we call it, up and down with levels of anxiety, fear and burnout. And one of the things we have spent a lot of time is helping them to think about even small changes that they can make, right through to the big system changes. So we have brought in a whole range of different practice approaches, some of whom you'll hear from today actually, around Safe and Together, a programme that is rolled out particularly in Edinburgh, but is in parts of London as well, that works very specifically with families around domestic abuse and child protection. We've also spent a lot of time looking at restorative approaches. We think that restorative and transformative justice approaches are extremely important for us to think about in the context particularly of Black Lives Matter. There is no doubt, and the pandemic has also demonstrated this, that we don't have a policing system that works and is experienced as working in the same way for all sections of our community. I've already mentioned this. We're now seeing it in relation to sexual violence more generally. And so we need to develop much more nuanced strategies and differentiate and listen to the different needs of different parts of our communities. So as I say, restorative approaches come from First Nation peoples in Canada, Australia, and from the Maori community in New Zealand. And what they are crucially engaging with is naming the harm, but avoiding or trying to deal with the problems that come with just what you call it, rupturing relationships rather than restoring them, and expelling or sending people away from communities. Really strong tradition of trying to keep already marginalized peoples together in communities, whether it's children or whether it's men, but trying to name and deal with the harm. Transformative justice is much more explicitly, particularly it's been doing a lot of work around sexual abuse, about how you deal with the harm. This is not a soft option by any means. I know it's controversial in many places, but it is absolutely about naming the harm, about making people accountable for the harm, but not about always expelling, sending people away. But it is crucially in communities that have known a great deal of trauma and dispossession, it is about trying to heal and repair. Couples work has been very controversial in domestic abuse work. Most practitioners are terrified of it, fear they're going to make things worse. But actually we have had some excellent examples from Alicia Lee, in particular from Doncaster, talking about the work she's done with situational couple violence over the years. So a long track record of keeping women safe and keeping children safe. But looking at how that work is nuanced, how it engages with the realities of, in Doncaster, very deprived white communities. In other parts of the country, it's about working with people, and this will be crucial going forward from the pandemic as we confront the reality of unemployment, of poverty, of the stresses that are going to come with precarity. We will need to develop a whole range of strategies to engage with how men and women are dealing with what's going on for them. Family group conferencing is very linked to the restorative approaches rolled out in Leeds for domestic abuse. Again, very controversial at the time, but over time has been worked with very carefully and sensitively. And Kate was involved in the evaluation of that, and there is an article on that if people are interested. Caring Dads, well, I don't need to talk about Caring Dads with Dermot Brady from Kingston involved in today. But again, that works very well, and we had very strong inputs from men who are on Caring Dads programs at the Change program, again to bring the humanity of people into the room and to get people engaging with each other as human beings. So we've left some links and resources. As Kate said at the beginning, she has spent a weekend reflecting as a woman on what's happening in our society. I have to say, I went through the same process this weekend. You know, I joined my first women's group over 40 years ago, and the fact that we are still struggling with so many of the same issues makes me feel very, very unhappy, and also, of course, very angry and determined to continue to do things about it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there now, I think.
Hello everyone, and yeah, it's just a hand over to the next speaker, and we're delighted to welcome Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England. So thank you, delighted to welcome Nicole next.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here, and I'm very interested to have heard Professor Featherstone and Morris, because so much of what they said and outlined is my own experience in terms of reflections on practice and thinking about the improvements, or just kind of outlining what are the key issues in relation to children's social care, domestic abuse, emerging themes and issues that we really need to concentrate on. So I'll try to weave some of that in throughout my presentation, but my main objective is to just make sure that you all know a bit about the Office of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is now today having its last day of report stage in the House of Lords, and we'll soon go back to the Commons, really to finish and wrap up, and to talk a little bit about the functioning of my office, how that relates to the kinds of things that you'll be doing and thinking about, and really is a bit of an invitation for people who are listening and working day to day in domestic abuse to kind of understand what's the best way to interact with our office and what you can expect from me as the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. This is just a quote from Victoria Atkins, which shows, you know, when I was appointed about a year ago, you know, what the Domestic Abuse Commissioner is meant to do. I'm appointed by government, so very similar to that of the Children's Commissioner or the Victims Commissioner, both of which I work very closely with. So you're appointed and kind of have an amount of funding by government, but the legislation itself, the Domestic Abuse Bill, gives my office a statutory underpinning and really sets out quite clearly in a lot of detail the independence of the office. So in thought, in policy work, we are quite independent from government and intend to be, but that doesn't mean we don't spend a good bit of time advising government, interacting with various government departments, and that's certainly one of the things I intend to do. But it is about raising the profile of domestic abuse, making sure that many survivors have an ability to have their voice heard, and as previous speakers talked about, the need for more intersectionality, more diversity in terms of that voice and lived experience, and that we really we're not the only way in our office, but really an important new way of making sure we have across all government departments at the local, national level, a real focus on this issue, because I think, as we would all agree, we're a bit behind in terms of where we need to be. Maybe a bit is an understatement. I won't spend very much time on this, but I guess it's true to at least highlight just the absolute prevalence of domestic abuse, the intersections with other forms of you know, violence against women and girls, obviously not always only affecting women, but you've got intersections with sexual violence, so-called honor-based abuse, forced marriage, stalking, and harassment. All of those things are part and parcel, not always exclusively of domestic abuse, but huge overlaps. And we have high prevalence. 2.4 million people will have been affected by domestic abuse or would have been subject to domestic abuse in the last year. We have police reported crimes slightly up in this year. We have huge costs to society. This is the Home Office analysts themselves costing out a £66 billion figure in the year ending March 2017. And the reason why it's outlined that way is that it considers the fact that we know from our national data sets for domestic abuse specialist services that it takes about 3 years for people to get to the support that they need. So that costing includes that and in the figures. 1 in 5 children live with domestic abuse and very low conviction rates. We have a trend, sadly, in the last 5 years of about a 31% decrease in conviction rates for domestic abuse. We have a much bigger decrease in terms of sexual violence or rape convictions, as you probably know. So we have huge problems in our criminal justice system, but that's not the only place. And so I think this does intersect with children's social care, because so often, particularly people who may be new to domestic abuse or may not have as much training, might assume that there would be, everyone that they might see will have had interactions with the police, recorded domestic abuse in some way through the criminal justice system. And you can see from these figures that's highly unlikely. So the purpose of our office is to really drive change in relation to domestic abuse. And one of the key issues is that, the prevalence rates are very high. In my view, our systems are not catching up with, or haven't caught up yet in terms of systemic change with our understanding of domestic abuse, the importance of domestic abuse in terms of it being quite a core subject for policing, but for housing, for health services, for children's social care, the whole range of places where someone might come for support and advice. Maybe not support and advice specifically for domestic abuse. It could be for other things. And yet in these systems, what we've heard in the previous conversation, and I would very much reinforce, is often we see situations where myths and stereotypes about domestic abuse prevail, lack of identification, lack of discussion about domestic abuse. So we see in homicide reviews, for example, which we've been doing consistently since 2011, that most of the one of the most core overarching lessons to be learned in those homicides is the extent to which we don't identify domestic abuse when we see it. So when we see indications in all sorts of frontline work, the discussion about domestic abuse is not had, it's not identified. Therefore, all of the really great practice we might look to doesn't happen. So that whole referral pathway that we could beautifully lay out into all sorts of interventions and services and support doesn't happen. And so these are people who are not isolated from services. They often see services, in particular health services, at higher rates than the average. But it's the domestic abuse that's not identified. So we have a lot to do there. We have a lot to do in terms of what I've got here in the second point, the postcode lottery. And what I mean by that is services differ from area to area. Some of the services you'll hear about today won't be available in all areas. Some of our best practices are not available in all areas. And so when I mean services, I mean the domestic abuse specific services for children, for adult survivors, for perpetrators to change. And what you'll see is in refuges, for example, that will differ from area to area. And so that's because, having been in those services myself and worked in those services for many, many years, they've grown up over time. If you think our first refuges were about 50 years ago, some of our most prevalent community-based services are a little over 20 years ago. They've kind of been added on and patched together and built up by a combination of public funds, but also trusts and foundations, charities going out and fundraising for themselves, bringing that innovation and work to local areas. And so what you see is very often a patchwork, which is very hard to hold together if you're the service. And then that makes it harder for children's social care, housing, health services, anyone who wants to partner and build on that innovation. It makes it harder. So that's really holding us back. And that's a huge priority from my office. And I'll talk about some progress in that area and when we get to the bill. So overarching priorities into the future, you can absolutely count on the fact that in my team, and I think I have Connie from my team who's joined and will be listening to presentations today. You know, my team mainly focuses on kind of policy, communications, some research and analytic posts, and practice and partnership posts, which I will come to in a moment. But essentially, even though I have the title of commissioner, that doesn't mean I commission the services. So my job is, and our job in the office is to really make sure that we develop a mapping of services, that we're really clear that we use the powers in our office, which are given to us by the bill, domestic abuse bill, which is about seeking information from public bodies and a duty to cooperate, an ability to make recommendations of public bodies that have to be responded to within 56 days. You know, we'll use those powers to really make sure that we map services, really have good data in front of us, not only about the specialist services, but about all public bodies and what they're doing or not doing in relation to domestic abuse. And I feel that it's not the only way, but it's one way that we can contribute to really pushing in, whether it's a policy framework within government or strategic plans within delivery bodies such as CPS or police or others, or talking to trusts and foundations about the role they play in terms of the strategic development in these areas. Most timely is obviously we're dealing with and have been throughout the year the impacts of COVID, and I won't talk in depth about that right now, but I'll come back to it. I'm sure this is even too small for you to read practically, but this is just a very basic graphic that says this is the kind of information we'll bring together in my office to try to do that kind of mapping and monitoring long term, and really with the aim of producing reports that are very tangible, very practical, with recommendations to really get the progress that we need in this area. The domestic abuse bill is this is a long running bill. It's had a lot of stops and starts. We're finally, I think, in our end stages. We've got a final day in the Lords today. Then there'll be a few days gap and we'll go back to the Commons. There's been some really interesting amendments that have been passed in the Lords that now the Commons will have to vote on, and I'll go through those. But what the bill essentially does is I told you it establishes my office, which is great. It creates our first statutory definition of domestic abuse. So all the years I've worked, I've always trained to a cross-government agreed definition. Now we'll have a statutory definition on the face of the bill. It names children in their own right as victims of domestic abuse. It reflects our ideas about coercion and control, and it includes financial abuse, very importantly in that. It provides for a new order of protection, a DAPO order, or early stages and notice, and then an order. This won't be immediately effective. It's going to be piloted over the course of a couple of years before you'll see that roll out all over. But the order into the future would give us a lot more flexibility than we currently have about applying in either criminal court, civil court. It will allow for third parties to apply for orders. It allows for positive requirements to be placed on perpetrators for mental health assessments, substance misuse, behavioral change programs. So there's a lot of unpicking in terms of getting that piloting right. And also an overarching point we would make consistently is you have to have the right services in place in order to attach a positive requirement. So but that's an important order. It places a duty on local authorities for safe accommodation. So again, kind of solving part of our problem about that postcode lottery potentially, if it's implemented well, which is you know, that aspect of refuge provision or accommodation-based services, essentially this bill places a duty on local authorities to map. And this bill is expected to pass in the spring, and local authorities are meant to, as soon as possible, be taking up that duty. So there's a lot of work going on right now at the local level, at a tier 1 board, a county-wide level, in terms of mapping and needs assessment. Government, because they're placing a duty, has set aside funding, so £125 million in the spending review in the budget rather, to go to local authorities to cover that duty. I would like to see that duty extended to community-based services, and the best we've got to so far is an agreement with the government that they will consult on that this summer for the victims bill. So I think into the future, with some of the mapping that my office will be doing and the commitment to that that consultation in the summer, I think we're getting a little bit closer to that aim. Some of the things the bill does also just improve some of the criminal justice family court provisions, things like prohibiting perpetrators from cross-examining victims in family court settings, which does happen, and so it will prohibit that. It creates, you know, an automatic kind of special measures in criminal court, and now that's been extended to family court. So there's some tightening up of provision. It places guidance on our disclosure scheme, which I think is very important for children's social care, because I think some of the disclosures will happen there in terms of, you know, you being aware of prior convictions of a perpetrator and making sure that that is known to the survivor, who may or may not know about those convictions. So it puts a statutory footing for that disclosure scheme. There's also some changes, sorry, next slide, in relation to priority need for domestic abuse. So it currently, the priority need is a combination of having children and domestic abuse that allows for that priority need. The bill has made an important change to say, regardless of whether one has children or not, that you have a priority need for domestic abuse. So there's huge amounts of important steps in this bill. And interestingly, I'm sorry, I should have corrected that this is an old slide, because since I made this slide, we have some really great progress. So like I said, this first brought my priority, and along with many others, was broadening that duty. That we now have a commitment for the government to consult on that. That's a great step forward. I think the bill needs to have provision for migrant women. So regardless of anyone's status or recourse to public funds, you know, they should be able to access services. They should be able to talk to the police without fear of information being passed along to immigration services. That has not happened yet in the bill. And so that would be, if you're interested, I know there's a lot of people on this call, this would be a perfect time to email your MP and state that if you agree with me. We have had success on non-fatal strangulation, so it will be a standalone offense. That's been an amendment to the bill the government's made itself. We've also had an extension of coercion and control legislation, so it will be applicable post-separation, which again is another really great change that the government itself has accepted and put into the bill. That's important for you to understand, because so often if you're supporting someone post separation and there's financial abuse, there's abuse in terms of the range of coercion and control that wouldn't technically fall under stalking or harassment, you now will have a provision that will be really important, that it's covered in that coercion and control legislation. We also now, we can see, this is great. This is quite satisfying for me, this slide, because it makes me realize how many wins we've had in terms of changes to the bill. We now will have a threat. The threat to share indecent images is now going to be an offense as well. We don't have paid leave. We don't have some of the family court related work, but some of that doesn't require, the family court related work doesn't necessarily require legislation. And there's a real focus in my office about getting on with the harm panel report. If any of you have not read that, I would say please go back and look at this July report that was published by the MOJ which looked at and you know, the findings from a harm panel, which was about domestic abuse and how it's dealt with in the family courts. And there's a very, very important Court of Appeal case that we're waiting for now, which really looks at how consistently are our family courts applying some of the practice directions in relation to domestic abuse, because I have really huge concerns about some of what's going on in families. I wanted to just say a word about responding to COVID. You know, obviously we've had huge amounts of awareness raising over the past year. We've had a lot of increase in people help seeking. On average, you'll have read in the media, and I can tell you usually that's been pretty accurate. On some days and some weeks, we've had huge increases in our helplines. I meet with all of our helplines in England and Wales and the organizations that represent services, as well as all government departments. We have a meeting. It was every week, and now it's every 2 weeks. I had it yesterday, and I can tell you that all of that surge in demand is it's still there. So big comparisons when we look at week, you know, from comparable week last year. But essentially over the course of the year, there's been on average about a 34% increase across all helplines in terms of demand. We've seen much larger increases in, you know, web chat, looking at web pages, emailing into those services. And we also see, when lockdown alleviates, quite a surge in demand for community-based services, refuge. So a lot of help seeking when the lockdown is stricter, and then much more surge as lockdown measures decrease. So I think with a combination of schools going back and lockdown measures starting to alleviate, as we all hope they will in coming weeks, I think we're going to see quite a demand over the summer for both policing and criminal justice, but also all of our frontline services. I've heard some really good feedback about children's social care interaction with domestic abuse services during COVID. You know, much more of kind of a responding, working together if they're having trouble getting in touch with families. But what I also know is that, you know, while contact is in getting reconnected with families is looking fairly good, the last figures I've heard from the Department of Education show that our, you know, assessments and new families coming to light is still lower than last year by a fairly significant percentage. So there's a great fear that there's a lot of harm being done and a lot of interaction that's needed that just hasn't happened yet. I guess one of the things I'll close with is just saying, obviously, a huge open invitation to get in touch with our office. One of the things, if I had to, you know, be quite frank with you all about the provision of service in domestic abuse, is that there are some places and there's some types of things where I think we have really good evaluation, really good pockets of best practice. And that is quite simple in terms of thinking we need to just roll that out. We need to make sure that there's enough resource and ambition within government and to really do that. And I think within children's social care and services for children in general, there are some really great practices out there. But it gets a little bit more complicated because some of the practices are within commissioned and kind of sit within children's social care, broader teams, early intervention teams. Some of the time there's commissioned out services. It's harder for me as commissioner to really understand what good looks like. I'm very interested in anything that could help us and help inform my team about what you think is working well. And so I do genuinely mean that when I say, you know, please be in touch, tell us what you think is working or what's certainly not working. I've been really impressed with some of the family safeguarding models where you can see more of the team around the family, you know, somebody who really leads with the child, someone who leads with the non-abusing parent and the abusing parent. That feels like a really great initiative and setup in terms of what kind of emphasis we really need. Safe and together for baby's sake, some of the things you'll hear about today, caring dads. We really need to have these discussions, which is why it's so perfect that you've got new thinking and practices for services and domestic abuse. I think this is one area where my office could certainly, you know, learn a lot from people here today and from you, and really think about what good looks like. What do we need to see more of, or what do we need to research and understand better, and what are the gaps there? So those are the kinds of things that are very much on my mind. There's some really interesting what works for children's social care initiatives, all of that. I think things are there and happening, but I think we need to bring together some of our thinking and really make that change. So I hope this presentation has given you a good sense of where some of these might lie with my office, what we're doing, what you might expect from us, and hopefully what you could be very excited about in terms of the domestic abuse bill. One thing I should just say as a last comment, there'll be a statutory guidance, which is really important, that will run alongside the bill, which will be published at the end of the bill. That will certainly have a good amount of information in it in terms of guidance in relation to children in domestic abuse. And so there's so much both opportunity in the bill and in that guidance and in a new VOG strategy, which is again being the call for evidence was reopened last Friday in light of Sarah Everard and a lot of the public outrage and discussions about how women feel safe in our society or not. And so take advantage of that. That will be open for another week. You can look on the Gov website and try to influence that VOG strategy. So we have a lot of opportunities ahead. And I will close there and just thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to present to you all. And have a great rest of your session.
Can I pass on to Amanda McIntyre, the For Baby's Sake Trust, to talk about some practice issues and achievements from their work.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be with you all, and a very happy St Patrick's Day to you all too. It's lovely to be following Nicole. In a minute, I'm going to play an animation with some parents telling their story of being on the For Baby's Sake programme. We launched that actually with Nicole speaking at the launch, and at that time, on that occasion, we called for improvements with the new domestic abuse framework to recognise the needs of babies and families and parents to get help starting in pregnancy. And one of the successes from last week's debate in Parliament was that the government is actually committed to strengthening their guidance now to recognise the needs of parents and babies starting in the womb. As I say, we are going to start now with a short film with parents who've been on the For Baby's Sake programme, telling their story about what brought them into the programme and the impact it had on them.
The first few years or so, who you are as a person is set up in those first few years.
Both my mum and dad probably had their own challenges growing up. Certainly my mum did.
My dad was an alcoholic. He was very angry, very depressed.
Things were good and then they'd be bad, and there was a lot of instability.
I was a teenage delinquent, stealing cars, selling drugs, just making a nuisance of myself.
I learnt to be quiet and keep things inside, and then really escaped in my imagination, and that's where I came alive.
I met my girlfriend. It was kind of like in the movies.
It turned my world upside down. We had that bond.
And within 2 months of that, she was pregnant. I think we both kind of went into panic mode.
It was very stressful. The idea of being homeless and pregnant. Where are we going to get the money?
We started having quite bad arguments.
And he put his hands around my neck until I couldn't breathe. Which is what led us into For Baby's Sake.
I kind of came into the programme thinking, am I just broken beyond repair?
The practitioner, she helped me find so much clarity. It triggered me into a very dark place. But obviously we were dealing with domestic abuse, but it didn't feel like we were just pointing the finger.
He was very respectful, listened very carefully to what I was saying. How on earth are we going to have a kid? and just helped me come up with practical solutions.
To be able to work through these self-destructive patterns, make some peace with the past, putting tools in place to keep me safe and to keep him safe too.
At every stage we had someone that really was trained and knew what they were doing, explaining to us what our baby was going through. Then we had more space for us to figure out our relationship.
It's allowed me to heal and come into myself. What are you doing? It's given me confidence to be a good mum.
I can be a bit less erratic now. I can live a normalish life and have a family.
He has two parents that want to do whatever it takes to be the best parents they can be for him.
He's had the best start in my family, as far back as anyone can remember, and that is not an accident.
I don't know how many times the two of us have said thank God for baby's sake. It's been life-changing.
We are incredibly grateful to the parents who participated in the film. I feel like I've given myself a challenge now, because I've got that sort of follow that challenge after you've heard from the parents, and I will try to do them justice by explaining a bit more about For Baby's Sake and how it works. So For Baby's Sake is a programme for both parents. We have no agenda about whether the parents join as a couple or whether they separate during the programme or beforehand. And actually that freedom they find very empowering. We currently operate in 4 area-based sites in Hertfordshire, 1 in London, working in Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea, and Hammersmith and Fulham, 1 in Blackpool, and we're also launching a new channel to deliver the programme called For Baby's Sake Connect, and I'll say a bit more about that later. As I say, both parents join during pregnancy and we work with them until their baby is 2. The programme goes through a series of modules, but it does that in a very flexible way, meeting the parents where they are. The desire to be a good mum and a good dad is a really powerful motivator for change, and the programme harnesses that motivation. And through the programme, we're looking to help the parents bring an end to the domestic abuse, overcome and process their trauma, and also to give their baby the best start in life. And while that sounds ambitious, our theory of change is actually that we stand a better chance of empowering the parents to do any one of those things if we go for the lot, because leaving out any of those ingredients makes it harder. So I'm going to talk now about how it's safety first, trauma informed and attachment focused. Really just this quote from the mum underlines how important the therapeutic relationship is between the parents and the practitioners in bringing about the change. And hopefully you saw that also from the film. The importance of being non-judgmental, really non-judgmental. So it's a whole family programme, and we're concerned with both adults and children and baby safeguarding. And we have an integrated and holistic way of doing that. We are assessing the needs and the risks of each family member and also of the family as a whole through the programme. Supervision and case management is crucial to the safe way of working. There is external group clinical supervision and restorative one-to-one restorative supervision for the team members. And the case management is also a vital part of how we work. It supports professional curiosity when the teams are together discussing the cases. Crucially, the programme operates in a very integrated and embedded way with local authority safeguarding pathways. And in our area-based teams, we even use the local authority case management systems. For risk assessment, we use the SARA 3, that's the Spousal Assault Risk Assessment Framework. I think we use it in a very innovative way. I don't think there are many whole family programmes operating in the community that use SARA 3, and it really it's holistic, and it supports our way of working. And as I said before, the relationship, the trusting relationship between the practitioners and the parents is central actually to our safeguarding model, because parents are much more likely to disclose and work through safeguarding incidents and situations when there's an escalation, for example. We work to help our parents make sense of their past so that they can understand the link between the past and the present, and really make sense of their unconscious world and what it is that's driving their behaviour. So often when parents join our programme, they'll say, I know I'm behaving this way, but I don't know why. And so the trauma-informed approach really helps them with that. We're validating the parents' feelings and encouraging them to understand what they've experienced and the impact on itself, on themselves now. The therapeutic core of the programme is an inner child module, and we're trauma informed throughout. And this really helps parents to take responsibility, particularly the parents who are using the abusive behaviour. And all of that work is within, again, a multi-agency recovery framework, which provides a unique trauma-informed pathway. Our parents really do have complex trauma histories. 70% of them on average would have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And often our parents lack resilience factors as well. So it's hard for them to give their baby the best start in life. We're looking to empower our parents so that their babies have secure attachments. Key factors for our parents are unresolved loss and trauma, and often, as I say, their own childhood experience was of disconnected and insensitive parenting, which makes it harder for them to provide the sensitive care that their babies need. We use a number of interventions, including video interaction guidance. This is fantastic. This is where you film the parent and the baby, and you go away and edit it and come back with the moments of really attuned interaction. And our parents watch this in amazement. You know, quite often parents will say things like, I didn't realise my baby loved me. And even antenatally, you know, the emphasis on mentalization, helping our parents to really be mindful of their baby. Our antenatal module is called Where's the Baby? And so we're focusing on mentalization and attunement, all within an attachment focused framework. There's a little clip you can hear from a father, so you can see how you put all of these things together, the safeguarding, the trauma-informed and the attachment-focused and the therapeutic relationship. And you can hear from this father the difference it's made.
I feel like I've grown than I have in my whole life. Much about myself, my parents, my upbringing, my behavior, my reactions, and now I feel more in control of myself.
In May last year, we published an evaluation led by King's College London, Louise Howard and Kylie Trevelyan, with a team of academics, including Professor Nikki Stanley, social worker professor at the University of Central Lancashire, and Harriet McMillan from McMaster University in Ontario. They conducted a 4-year evaluation of our first 2 sites in Hertfordshire and London, and they also did a systematic review of the evidence. And they concluded that For Baby's Sake was the first programme in the world actually to address key limitations of whole family responses to domestic abuse. And they emphasised that the difference in our model, as you can see in the quote, other interventions do not target the impacts of domestic violence and abuse in utero or combine trauma-informed domestic violence and abuse support with attachment-focused parenting support for both parents. Key gaps that For Baby's Sake is addressing within this programme. So the evaluation really drew out the benefits of this holistic approach starting in pregnancy. Just a couple of the findings. In terms of the outcomes, the baby's birth and development outcomes were largely within the normal range. And when you think about domestic abuse, doubling risk of low birth weight, preterm birth, and also the challenges in terms of secure attachment and emotional and social development for our babies, you know, these are really promising signs. Also, for the families who took part in the evaluation, King's College London team found that only a third of them had any children's social care input at the end of their programme at 2 years, which contrasted with 70% at the baseline. The evaluation found various signs of personal growth for the parents, including that a number of them reached decisions for themselves that it was right for them to separate. In the evaluation, a third of all the parents at the end of the evaluation were still in the couple relationship, whereas 2/3 of the women and all of the men were in the relationship at the start. You know, we've got no agenda about whether parents stay together or separate. The key point here is that they were empowered to work out for themselves what was right and to make those changes. The evaluation also found that particularly a lot of the women felt very empowered to speak out and say what it was they were willing to accept and not accept. And the evaluation said that was particularly poignant for a number of the mothers from minority ethnic backgrounds who particularly faced cultural barriers through expectations about what they couldn't say. So the personal growth is important. The next slide just has a little quote from a father who's talked about putting his kids first instead of himself. You know, and the inner child work and the trauma-informed approach, as well as our parents understanding domestic abuse, really comes together to enable the father to be able to say something like that. Where we're going next. So we launched the evaluation, which was going to be our springboard for rolling out the programme and sharing the learning. And of course, this was all happening in the midst of lockdown. So that's had a bearing on where we've gone next, in quite interesting ways, actually, because throughout lockdown, we've continued to deliver the programme without ceasing, using video and phone calls. And the therapeutic relationship between the practitioner and the parents really was maintained. And parents said they liked the flexibility and the support they got with their emotional regulation. And the success of being able to do that has enabled us to develop an additional way of rolling out the programme now. So alongside our area-based teams, we're launching now for Baby Safe Connect. So practitioners will work using phone and video technology, and we can deliver the programme through the Connect team to families who are living in areas that don't currently have their own local area-based team. We still want to have area-based teams, and the capacity that brings to a local area is really important. But we've got this extra way now of scaling up the programme. We're also keen to share our learning, and we're starting to put out some more tools and resources that we're using within the programme, so that a wider community can access that. And do have a look on our website for those tools and resources. And we've also, as part of our sharing the learning, we've also been raising awareness, going back to where I started, about the value of parents starting to seek help during pregnancy. And we're currently running some radio adverts, actually. You know, there have been lots of great public health information adverts on the radio and elsewhere about domestic abuse throughout the COVID pandemic. None of them have particularly been speaking to parents, and so you might hear them. We've got some adverts on LBC, Capital Extra, and some of the regional heart radio stations as well, including voices of our own parents encouraging parents to come forward and seek help during pregnancy or when they've got small babies, to help them feel more able to do that. My final slide, and hope it's not going to be too jerky, is to leave you with the voice of a mother. I just love the confidence and the cheeriness in this mum's voice, and this is one mother's message to others mothers about joining the programme. Thank you very much.
I think anyone who is thinking about referring themselves or starting the programme should jump in with 2 feet. The practitioners are, you know, honestly the best people I've met professionally. They won't be judgmental, they don't give up, and they're really understanding and flexible.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, for that really interesting presentation. And we're running just a little bit late, so I'm going to ask Rick straight away to raise some of the questions and comments that we've had from people who are watching.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thanks very much to the speakers. That was, you know, extraordinarily thought-provoking and interesting, and you can see that from the amount of discussion that's been going on in the Q&A and in the chat. Too much, obviously, to do justice to in a Q&A slot, but I'll try and pick up some themes that may be of interest for people, some speakers to respond to. Following on from the first presentation by Brid and Kate, there was some discussion of you know, how intersectionality actually work in practice in relation to services for domestic abuse. And one of the issues that was raised was around immigration and about how that feeds into the dynamics of intimate partner relations.
Do you want to go, Brid, and then I?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, actually, that issue didn't come up so much in the change programme, but last year I ran a practice forum for ASYEs. That's for the assessed and supported year in employment, you know, the first year for social workers, for those who don't know. And absolutely, that came up all the time, the way in which immigration status was used to keep women to keep women absolutely cowed and very, very powerless, and really, you know, very poignant examples in particularly white parts of Calderdale, or Kirklees, which is where I was doing it, of where women were very, very isolated from other women from their own cultural background, and were very dominated by the family and by the man in particular. So yes, in terms of intersectionality, Day and Gail have done some work. We did look at this in the change programme. Day and Gail have done some work about how it inhibits help seeking. Why are you going to tell the police if you're afraid you will be deported or somebody in your family will be? So it's a huge issue that's very, very pertinent.
And I suppose it's just worth adding, just a reminder, I know people will know this, but you are over 12 times more likely to have your child in the care and protection system if you live in the poorest areas. And so with domestic abuse and violence is a significant factor now in our child protection services. We have to make a connection between the experiences of domestic abuse and violence and children and families' social and economic circumstances. We also know that you raise income, you reduce the rates of child abuse and neglect. These are conversations we can't avoid having in relation to domestic abuse and violence. We have to think differently about how we support men and how we support women and how we support children, and pay attention to their social and economic circumstances. And that would include issues to do with disability, ethnicity, immigration status, poverty. For too long, we have rolled out responses that are, as Brid says, blind to those key contextual factors, and I think that's a point we really wanted to get over this morning, and it came out of the Change project and the Child Welfare and Equality study, and indeed the work that Rick's done.
Thank you both. Another aspect of what you might call overlapping social disadvantage and so on is the difficulties particularly experienced by women and people with disabilities in relation to domestic abuse and violence and being heard and having an appropriate response. I think one of the questions in the Q&A was for Nicole Jacobs, but I think she's had to leave to go to another meeting. Kate, Brid and Amanda, is that something that's come up in your work, and did you have any thoughts to give on that?
This is the nature of intersectionality, isn't it? And this is what we are realizing with the pandemic, that everything is connected, and that, so people with disabilities are, particularly families with children with disabilities, are among the poorest in our society, and it's cause and consequence. You know, people having to give up work because of disabilities, etc. I just wanted to reiterate what Kate was saying, that we absolutely, at the core of everything we do now, particularly going forward post-pandemic, we have to have an anti-poverty strategy for all of this. Domestic abuse is so connected and related to poverty. It's not caused by poverty, we know that, but it is related to poverty. It's part of the jigsaw.
Thank you.
It's also part of understanding how much you know, I think it's Brid uses that wonderful quote, which is, we might all be in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And so for many women, the thinking around safety has a very different context when you place it in the context of social and economic circumstances. So I think just trying to really, in practice, start to pay really careful attention to the social and economic circumstances of the children, the women, the men that we work with, will start to shift some practices and some policies. And we certainly heard that amongst the Change project participants, and I don't know if for Amanda that's also an issue in the service that she's developed and described.
I think one point I'd add, I agree with everything that's been said already. One point I'd add as well is about the importance of always enabling parents to tell their stories and to validate their feelings. You know, it's so vital that that we make it as easy as possible for people to have conversations. And actually, we're starting to develop some trauma tools to support practice, and the trauma tools are actually all about supporting conversations between professionals and parents, and also conversations between frontline workers and those who are supervising them. Because the more we can have those conversations, the more we can work out where the barriers are, the emotional barriers and the practical and the physical and the economic barriers.
This is all important, so we'll take another 5 minutes into the comfort break and then break in about 5 minutes time. Rick, did you have more comments to put for this?
Yes, one of the things that came up, well, there were a few things that people I think wanted to ask the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and I wonder whether the contact details that were provided would actually be a really good opportunity for people to kind of put those questions and get a response. So you know, I'm glad that it's given an opportunity for that. One of the things that was asked about for Nicole, but also to the other speakers, was about the experience of people in courts and how that was extremely problematic for so many people in this area, and it might not, you know, how do we change that, basically?
I think trying to prevent things from needing to get to court is clearly where we want to be. I think that all of the work that we do that's around emotional regulation and helping people understand their feelings can can also help in this. You know, the work that we do that right from the outset gives parents and this is not right for every family, by the way. I'm not saying that there should be co-parenting in every situation. Absolutely not. When we start though in pregnancy and we're working with both parents, we can give them the concept of co-parenting, continuing to be the mum and the dad to the baby. And we've got some very powerful, poignant learning from the work that we do with fathers who currently don't have access rights to their children, and helping them to hold the reality that they are still the father to that baby and that child. And again, helping them to put the baby's needs before theirs, and the impact that has on safety for the mother and safety for the baby, and holding out the possibility of longer term healing. And because we're working with families from pregnancy until the age of 2, we do see change where the father has not been able to have access to the baby for some time, and then by the end of the period of them working with us, they have actually started to have those access rights. And it's very, very moving. It's not easy work. It is very rewarding work for all of the family members, and also for society, given the cost to society that's also preventing. Yeah.
Amanda, a couple of people asked how your service, and actually domestic abuse service in general, deal with the issue of substance misuse. Parents often on our programme experience substance misuse, and again the trauma-informed approach, helping parents understand what was leading them to misuse substances, helps them to break away from it. There was an interesting example. I think we had an article in The Guardian a few months ago from parents, quoted some of our parents in Blackpool actually, who talked about managing to keep off drugs during lockdown, and because of the way in which they were engaging with our parents around their emotional regulation, and also filling their lives with other things, and actually being able to create some family time instead. It's not, you know, it's about taking a trauma-informed approach, which is, I think, where Dame Carol Black is going with her review as well. Everything needs to be trauma-informed.
Thank you for bringing those points in, Rick, and we'll try to get some more later. It's important people have their break so they can concentrate on the next part of the conference. So can I say very much thank you very much to Brid, Kate, Amanda, and to Nicole, even in her absence, for their tremendous contributions. It's clear that there's a lot to do, both personally, interpersonally, and in policy terms, but there are also a lot of opportunities and possibilities in what you've said today, and that's the exciting thing that we have to look forward to. So there's another opportunity to engage with these issues in relation to, particularly, I think, child protection and partnership working in the second session, but we'll take the break now and be back in time for the start again